The city breathed its evening sigh, a long, tired exhalation of grinding traffic and distant sirens. For Isabella Rossi, known to the few who cared to call her by it as Bella, it was the sound of respite. The bell above the door of her little flower shop, Bella Flora, chimed its final note for the day, and she turned the deadbolt with a soft, definitive click. The scent of lilies and damp earth closing around her, a familiar, calming perfume. This shop was her sanctuary, her hard-won slice of a life built on her own terms. Every stem placed in foam, every ribbon curled, was a quiet rebellion against the chaos she had fled. That chaos had a name, Marco, and as she wiped down the pristine countertops, her movements were punctuated by a familiar, low-thrumming anxiety. It was a tune she knew by heart, the symphony of hypervigilance. Her eyes, a warm shade of brown that had seen too much, kept flicking to the large front window, scanning the deepening twilight beyond the displays of Gerber daisies and roses. He was out there. She could feel it, a cold spot on the skin of her consciousness. Leaving him had been an act of war, and Marco had never been one to surrender anything he considered his property. She bundled up the day's discarded stems and leaves, her fingers, nicked with thorns and stained green, trembling slightly. The back alley was her least favorite part of the day. It was a narrow, brick-lined canyon that smelled of old garbage and damp concrete, a stark contrast to the curated beauty inside. Taking a steadying breath, she pushed the back door open, the metal groaning in protest. The dumpster was only 20 paces away, but tonight it felt like a mile. She never made it. A figure detached itself from the shadows near the high fence, and her heart plummeted into her stomach, cold and heavy as a stone. "Hello, Bella." Marco's voice was slick, a mockery of affection. He stepped into the jaundiced glow of the single security light. He was still handsome in a broken-down, pretty boy way, but his eyes were alight with familiar, possessive fire that made her skin crawl. Isabella froze, the bag of clippings held tight against her chest like a shield. "What do you want, Marco? I told you not to come here." "You told me." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the bricks. "You don't get to tell me anything. I go where I want, and I want to see my girl. I am not your girl." The words were brave, but her voice was a reedy whisper. He was on her in 3 swift strides. His hand, strong from construction work and a lifetime of anger, shot out and clamped around her upper arm. The pain was immediate and intense, a promise of bruises blooming beneath his fingers. "You are whatever I say you are," he snarled, his face inches from hers, his breath sour with cheap whiskey. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think your little flower shop makes you a big woman? You're nothing without me. Nothing." He shook her, hard, her head snapping back. Tears of pain and fury sprang to her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Let me go, Marco." "Or what?" he sneered, shoving her back against the cold, rough brick wall. The impact knocked the air from her lungs. "You'll call the cops? They didn't help you before. They won't help you now. You're mine, Isabella. You'll always be mine." Unseen by either of them, at the mouth of the alley where it met the main street, a long, black sedan sat idling, its tinted windows like obsidian eyes. In the plush back seat, Luca Lombardi was concluding a piece of business. He was a man of stillness, his presence a void of calm in the city's noise. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his hands, resting on his knees, were clean, the nails perfectly manicured, but they were the hands of a craftsman whose medium was violence. His men called him the Wolf, not for his savagery alone, but for his patience, his unnerving focus. He listened to his underboss, Antonio, with half an ear, his gaze drifting to the alleyway, drawn by the commotion. He watched the scene of domestic squalor with a detached, analytical coldness. A man, a woman, a struggle. It was a common, pathetic story. He saw the man, Marco, slam the woman against the wall again, saw her face, pale and terrified in the sickly light, a streak of blood now trickling from her split lip where his ring had caught her. There was a fierce, defiant light in her eyes, though a refusal to break that Luca found interesting. Most broke so easily. Luca held up a single finger, silencing Antonio mid-sentence. He watched for a moment longer, his dark eyes missing nothing. Then, with a quiet, deliberate movement, he opened the car door and stepped out into the evening. His approach was silent, his expensive shoes making no sound on the cracked asphalt. He didn't need to announce himself. His presence did it for him. The very air in the alley grew thick and cold. Marco, his back to the newcomer, was too enraged to feel the shift. But Isabella saw him. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked over Marco's shoulder onto the stranger. He was a silhouette at first. Then the light caught the sharp planes of his face, the impossible stillness of his posture. He wasn't a savior. He was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. Luca's voice cut through Marco's tirade, not a shout, but a low, resonant command that seemed to vibrate in the bones. "Remove your hand from her." Marco spun around, his face a mask of drunken belligerence. "Who the hell are you? This is a private conversation. Piss off." The words died in his throat as his brain finally processed whom he was addressing. The expensive car, the suit that cost more than his truck, the chilling, absolute stillness, the reputation that preceded the man like a wave of frost. The color drained from Marco's face. "As Senior Lombardi, I didn't—" Luca's gaze was fixed on Marco's hand, which was still viced around Isabella's arm. He took one more step forward, and the world seemed to shrink to the three of them in that grimy alley. His voice dropped to a whisper that was more terrifying than any scream. "Touch her again," Luca said, each word a shard of ice, "and I will break every finger on that hand, one by one. Then I will move on to the other. Do you understand me?" Marco's grip vanished as if her arm had become white-hot iron. He stumbled back, his bravado utterly shattered, replaced by pure animal fear. He looked from Luca's impassive face to Isabella's stunned one, muttering incoherent apologies, before turning and fleeing down the alley, his footsteps echoing his panic. And then it was just the two of them. Isabella stood trembling, her back pressed against the wall for support, her arm throbbing. Luca Lombardi turned his gaze upon her. It was not a gentle look. It was an assessment, deep and penetrating. He saw the blood on her lip, the terror in her eyes, the strength it had taken not to crumble. Without a word, he reached into his inner breast pocket and produced a handkerchief of impossibly white, fine linen. He held it out to her, not as an offer, but as a directive, her hand shaking. She took it. The fabric was soft against her skin. He didn't smile. He didn't offer reassurance. He simply looked at her for a moment longer, a silent, profound acknowledgement passing between them. Then he turned and walked back to his car, as calmly as if he had just stopped to check the time. The car door closed with a solid, expensive thud, and the sedan pulled smoothly away, melting into the stream of traffic. Isabella was left alone in the sudden silence, the pristine white handkerchief pressed to her bleeding lip, the scent of cologne, sandalwood, and something dark, like gunmetal lingering in the air. She was safe. Marco was gone. But as she stood there in the cold alley, a new, deeper chill settled in her soul. She had just been saved by a wolf, and she had a terrifying premonition that his shadow would now be longer and far more inescapable than Marco's had ever been. The silence in Isabella's apartment that night was a different kind of noise. It was heavy, expectant, a taut wire humming with the aftermath of the alley. The lock on her door, once a flimsy reassurance, now felt like a joke. Marco's key had long been taken, but his presence had seeped through the wood and brick anyway. And now another, far more formidable presence had joined it. She could still smell the ghost of sandalwood and cold air on the white linen handkerchief, which she had folded with absurd care and placed on her kitchen table like a sacred, terrifying relic. She had washed the blood from her lip, the cut stinging, but the memory of Luca Lombardi's voice, that quiet, absolute promise of violence, was a brand on her mind. Sleep was a fractured thing, a series of jerks and starts where the slam of a car door downstairs or the creak of the old building settling would jolt her awake, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Was it Marco, returning with a drunkard's courage? Or was it one of his men, the silent, suited specters from the black sedan? The line between predator and protector, in the stark hours of the night, felt dangerously thin. The next morning, she opened Bella Flora with a forced sense of normalcy. The familiar rituals of watering, trimming, and arranging were a balm, the vibrant colors and fragile petals a world away from the grim alley and its dark prints. Yet her body was a live wire. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her head snapped up, a cocktail of dread and something else, something she refused to name, flooding her system. Her co-worker, Sophia, chattered about her boyfriend, about a movie, about the price of tulips. Her normalcy a stark contrast to the war zone Isabella's life had become. It was on the second day that she began to notice the patterns, the subtle architecture of her new prison, or was a fortress. A man in a well-cut but nondescript gray suit sat on a bench across the street, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but he never turned the page. He was there for 2 hours, then was replaced by another man in a dark jacket. On her walk home, the same black sedan or one identical to it, idle at the far end of her block, its tinted windows hiding its occupants. It was never aggressive, never approached. It was just there, a constant, silent reminder that her life was no longer entirely her own. She was a specimen under glass, a pawn on a chessboard she hadn't known she was playing on. A week passed in this nerve-shredding limbo. The fear of Marco began to be slowly, insidiously, overshadowed by the oppressive weight of Luca's guardianship. Then, on a rain-slicked Thursday night, the fragile peace shattered. She was in her kitchen making tea when she heard the distinct, fumbling scratch of a key at her lock. A wrong key. Her blood turned to ice. It was Marco. She knew the clumsy, angry sound of his attempts. Paralyzed, she listened as he cursed softly, then began to put more shoulder into it, the wood of the doorframe starting to splinter. Terror held her frozen. This was it. He was inside her home, her final sanctuary. She gripped the counter, her knuckles white, waiting for the inevitable crash. But it never came. Instead, there was a scuffle, a muffled grunt of surprise and pain that was cut off abruptly, then the sound of something heavy being dragged down the hallway stairs. The silence that returned was deeper and more profound than before. She didn't sleep. She sat on her sofa, a knife and a block in her lap, staring at the door until the gray light of dawn filtered through the windows. When she finally mustered the courage to leave for work, there was no sign of a struggle in the hallway, no broken wood, no scuff marks. It was as if it had all been a horrific dream, but the memory was too vivid, too real. He came to the shop that afternoon. The bell chimed, and there he was, Luca Lombardi. He moved through her world of delicate flowers like a panther in a garden, his presence sucking the air from the room. Sophia, sensing a predator, suddenly found urgent business in the back. Luca didn't browse. His dark eyes found Isabella and pinned her where she stood behind the counter. "Your ex-boyfriend," he began, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather, "has been persuaded to reconsider his life choices. He will be relocating permanently." Isabella's mouth was dry. Persuaded? A flicker of something cold passed through his eyes. There and gone in an instant, he understood the benefits of a change of scenery. "You will not be troubled by him again." The finality in his tone was absolute. The relief that washed over her was so potent it felt like a physical weakness, and she hated herself for it. She was free of Marco. But the cost? "Thank you," she forced out, the words tasting like ash. "But I don't need your protection anymore. He's gone. So, thank you, but we're done." Luca studied her, his head tilted slightly. He reached out and, with a touch that was surprisingly gentle, traced a faint, yellowing remnant of a bruise on her wrist, a souvenir from the alley. A shiver, entirely unbidden, raced up her spine. "Done," he repeated, a whisper that carried the weight of stone. "This city is a jungle, little flower. You do not get to decide when the danger has passed." "I do." His finger left her wrist, and the spot felt cold. "You were being devoured by a stray dog. I put the dog down. But the jungle remains. And in this jungle, you have just been claimed by the wolf. That is not an offer. It is a fact of your new life. Accept it." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, leaving Isabella standing amidst the roses and lilies, the scent of his power and his cologne clinging to the air. The cage door, she realized with a sinking, terrifying clarity, had not been opened. It had merely been upgraded. She was safe from the dog. Yes, but she now belonged to the wolf. The days following Luca Lombardi's declaration in her shop congealed into a new, surreal form of normalcy. The fear, once a sharp, jagged thing aimed at a specific threat named Marco, had been melted down and recast into a constant, low-grade hum of existential dread. Isabella moved through her life as a guest in her own skin, acutely aware that every move was being observed, cataloged, and assessed by an unseen audience. The men in suits were permanent fixtures now, their presence so blatant it felt like an insult. They didn't bother with newspapers or pretense anymore. They simply stood, impassive and watchful, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, their silence more intimidating than any shouted threat. Her world had shrunk to the space between her apartment and Bella Flora, a gilded corridor under the unwavering gaze of the Lombardi syndicate. The gifts began to arrive on the third day. A courier delivered a long, velvet-lined box containing a single, flawless white orchid, a variety so rare and exotic she had only ever seen pictures of it in horticultural journals. There was no note. The next day, it was a bottle of wine from a vintage so old and prestigious it likely cost more than her monthly rent. Then a cashmere shawl, so soft it felt like a cloud, in a deep emerald green that she secretly loved. She never wore it. She left the gifts untouched on her kitchen table, a growing shrine to a patronage she never asked for. Each one was a brick in the wall of her new existence, a tangible reminder of the debt she was accruing with a man who charged interest in control. Sophia, her co-worker, was initially envious, chattering about his secret admirer, but she soon fell silent under the weight of Isabella's grim expression and the looming presence of men outside. The summons, when it came, was not a request. Antonio, Luca's underboss, a man with a face like a clenched fist and a voice that rasped like gravel, entered the shop and placed a heavy, cream-colored envelope on the counter. "The car will be outside your apartment at 8, he stated, his tone leaving no room for discussion. Inside was an invitation, handwritten in a sharp, aggressive script, to dinner at the Lombardi estate. That night, Isabella stood before her meager wardrobe, her fingers trembling as they brushed past her simple dresses. It felt like choosing an outfit for her own execution. She selected a simple black dress, the only thing she owned that felt remotely appropriate for an audience with a king. The black sedan was indeed waiting, a sleek predator at the curb. The drive was silent, the partition up, taking her through increasingly affluent neighborhoods until they passed through wrought iron gates and up a long, winding drive to a house that was less a home and more a fortress of old money and older stone. It was imposing, beautiful in a severe, cold way, with lights blazing from its many windows, illuminating manicured grounds that were undoubtedly patrolled by men with guns. Luca greeted her at the door himself, having dismissed whatever staff usually performed the task. He was dressed in a dark suit, no tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone. He looked her over, his gaze lingering on her simple dress, and while his expression didn't change, she felt assessed and found wanting. "Isabella," he said, her name a statement on his lips. The dinner was a tortuous affair of opulence and unspoken threats. They ate in a cavernous dining room under the glare of a crystal chandelier, the table long enough to seat 30, but set only for 2 at one end. The food was exquisite, each course a work of art, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. He spoke, not of the weather or trivialities, but of his world. He told her, in a calm, matter-of-fact tone, about the delicate ecosystem of fear and respect that governed the city, about his rivals, about the consequences of disloyalty. He wasn't bragging. He was educating her. He was painting a map of the jungle he commanded, and showing her exactly where she now stood within its borders. "You are safe here," he said, sipping his wine. "But safety is not free. It requires a clear understanding. Of me, of my rules." As a silent servant cleared the dessert plates, Luca leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on her. The air in the room shifted, growing heavier, more intimate and more dangerous. "The man who hurt you," he began, his voice dropping. "Marco, he is back in the city." The blood drained from Isabella's face. The fine meal turned to a lead weight in her stomach. "I had him brought back," Luca continued, watching her reaction with the focus of a scientist observing a specimen. "He is in a room, waiting." He is restrained, and he is afraid. Isabella could only stare, her mind reeling. "I am offering you a gift, Isabella," Luca said, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. "A chance to close your own circle. I will take you to him. You'll have 5 minutes. Alone. The door will be locked, and you may take this." With a quiet, deliberate motion, he placed a sleek, bone-handled switchblade on the polished table between them. It landed with a soft, definitive click. The world seemed to narrow to that knife. It was not an offer of justice. It was an invitation to damnation. He was not asking her to be saved. He was asking her to become like him, to stay in her own hands, to let the violence of his world become her own. This was the true price of his protection. It was not money or gratitude. It was her soul. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, waiting to see if the flower he had claimed had the capacity to grow thorns, and if she would be willing to use them. The silence in the grand room was absolute, broken only by the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. The night after Luca's offer was a chasm of silence and sleepless horror. Isabella lay in the dark of her apartment, but the opulent dining room and the glint of the bone-handled knife were seared onto the back of her eyelids. The choice he presented was a monstrous perversion, a devil's sacrament. To take the knife was to accept his world, its rules written in blood. To refuse was to show weakness, to prove herself unworthy of his brutal brand protection, and perhaps to invite a fate she couldn't imagine. It wasn't a choice between right and wrong, but between two different kinds of annihilation. The memory of Marco's hands on her, his voice in her ear, was a poison in her veins. The desire for vengeance was a hot, living coal in her chest. But was it a desire strong enough to make her a killer? When dawn finally broke, a pale, sickly light bleeding through the curtains, her body felt heavy, as if she had been fighting a physical battle all night. She moved through her morning routine like an automaton, the world seeming distant and muffled. At the shop, she snapped the stem of a rose she was trimming. The clean break a jarringly violent sound in the quiet space. She looked at her hands, the florist's hands, capable of nurturing life, of creating beauty. Could they truly hold a knife and plunge it into living flesh, even the flesh of a man who deserved it? Luca's proposition was a test, a crucible designed to forge her in his image or break her entirely. 2 days later, Antonio appeared at the shop once more. He said nothing, merely looked at her, a silent question in his hard eyes. Isabella, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, gave a single, sharp nod. The ride this time was different. The sedan did not travel to the opulent estate, but wound its way into the city's industrial underbelly, a landscape of rusting chain-link fences and warehouses with boarded-up windows. They stopped before a nondescript building, its corrugated metal door scarred with graffiti. Antonio led her inside, into a cavernous space that smelled of dust and old oil. In the center of the concrete floor, under a single bare bulb, was a single metal chair, and in that chair, bound and gagged, sat Marco. He was a pathetic sight. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, and he trembled uncontrollably. When he saw her, his one good eye widened in sheer, undiluted terror. He began to mumble incoherently against a gag, his body straining against the ropes. Antonio pressed the cold, hard shape of the switchblade into her palm. 5 minutes, he rasped, then walked to a door on the far wall, opening it to reveal a small, dark observation room before closing it behind him, leaving her utterly alone with the man who had been her nightmare. The knife felt alien and impossibly heavy in her hand. She clicked the button, and the blade sprang forth with a sound like a sharp, metallic sigh. Marco flinched, a low sob escaping him. Isabella walked toward him, her footsteps echoing in a vast, empty space. She could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the sheer animal fear in his posture. This wasn't the powerful, menacing abuser from the alley. This was a broken, terrified creature. She stopped just in front of him, the tip of the blade catching the light from the single bulb. She could do it. One quick, hard thrust. It would be so easy. All the pain, the fear, the humiliation. It could all end right here, with this single violent act. She raised the knife, her arm trembling with the weight of the decision. Marco squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the blow. But it didn't come. The image of Luca's impassive face, watching from the shadows, flashed in her mind. This was what he wanted, for her to become an instrument of his will, to prove her loyalty by getting her hands dirty, to become a part of his ecosystem of violence. And in that suspended moment, with the power of life and death trembling in her hand, she realized that giving in to that rage would not free her. It would only bind her to him more completely than any debt of gratitude ever could. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the knife. She clicked the blade back into its handle, the sound final and decisive. She leaned close, her voice a low, venomous whisper in his ear. "You are nothing," she said, each word a carefully aimed dart. "You were always nothing. And the only reason you're going to live is because I am not like you. I am not an animal. And I refuse to become one, even for this." She straightened up, looking down at his cowering form. The hot coal of vengeance in her chest had not gone out, but it had been transformed. It was no longer a desire for his blood. It was the cold, hard certainty of her own strength. She had faced her monster, not with his own weapons, but with her will. She had reclaimed her power not by taking his life, but by granting it. She turned her back on him, walked to the observation room door, and opened it. Luca was standing there, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He had seen it all. He had watched her raise the knife, watched her hold his power in her hand, and watched her choose her own. He did not look disappointed. He looked intrigued. A slow, dark appreciation kindled in his gaze. He had offered her the beast's way, and she had shown him something else entirely a strength he had not anticipated. That night, he came to her apartment. He didn't knock. His presence at her door was an assumption, a fact. When she opened it, the air between them was electric, charged with the unspoken events of the day. He didn't speak. He simply looked at her, his gaze a physical touch. Then he was on her, his hand tangling in her hair, his body pressing her back against the wall. His kiss was not gentle. It was a conquest, a violent, claiming pressure that was all teeth and desperate hunger. It was a culmination of all the tension, the fear, the obsession, the dark, twisted thread that had bound them since the alley. And Isabella, her body thrumming with the adrenaline of the day and the raw, magnetic force of him, did not push him away. She met his violence with her own, her fingers clawing at his shoulders, her kiss just as fierce, just as desperate. It was not an act of love, but a communion, a recognition of the darkness they both carried, a pact sealed not with a promise, but with a mutually assured destruction of their old selves. In that violent, passionate collision, the line between captive and captor blurred, then vanished entirely. The transformation was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, seismic shift deep within the bedrock of Isabella's soul. The woman who now looked back at her from a mirror each morning was a stranger, forged in the crucible of Luca Lombardi's world. The fear was still there, a faint, familiar hum, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It had been honed into a weapon of hyper-awareness, a cold, calculating clarity that colored her every move. She no longer jumped at the sight of the men in suits. She acknowledged them with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. They were no longer her jailers, but her retinue. The gilded cage had become a fortress, and she was learning to command its walls. Luca no longer kept his distance. He was a constant, pervasive presence, a force of nature that had settled into the fabric of her life. He came to her apartment not as a guest, but as its rightful occupant, his belongings slowly colonizing her space, a costly watch left on the bathroom sink, a jacket slung over a chair, the scent of his cologne embedded in her sheets. His touch was no longer just a violent claiming in the dark. It was a possessive brand, a constant reminder of the bargain she had made. And in the quiet moments, the terrifying truth would whisper in her ear. She did not recoil. The power that had once terrified her now felt like a drug, and she was developing a deep, unsettling addiction. The true test, the final unveiling, came in the form of an invitation to a gathering at a private, members-only club in the old city. This was not a dinner for two, but a summit of wolves. "It is time you saw the world you belong to," Luca told her, his tone leaving no room for refusal. He dressed her for the part, presenting her with a gown of deep crimson silk that clung to her like a second skin. It was the color of blood and power. As she stood before him, Transformed, he looked at her not with lust, but with profound, chilling pride. She was his masterpiece. The club was a den of old-world opulence and new-world threat. Powerful men with cold eyes and calculating smiles gathered in hushed groups, their conversations a quiet murmur over the clink of crystal. Their sleek, surgically enhanced companions cast curious, wary glances her way. Isabella walked beside Luca, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her chin held high. She felt the weight of their stares, the silent assessments, the speculation. She was the wolf's new prize. But she was determined to be more than that. It was an older man, a rival from a fading family, who made the fatal error. Emilio Conti, his face flushed with wine and arrogance, sought to challenge Luca's authority on a minor point of territory. Luca's response was a quiet, steely dismissal that brooked no argument. Humiliated, Conti's gaze slid to Isabella, a sneer twisting his lips. "And this is what you bring to a negotiation, Lombardi? A little flour to brighten the room? Perhaps you're going soft." The air in the room froze solid. Luca went preternaturally still, a predator sighting its prey. Before he could move, Conti, emboldened by the silence, reached out and grabbed Isabella's bare arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow in a grotesque echo of Marco in the alley. "Perhaps you would prefer a real man's company," he slurred. Isabella did not flinch. She did not gasp. She simply turned her head, her eyes meeting Luca's across the infinitesimal distance. In that shared glance, an entire conversation passed. A permission was granted. A line was crossed. Luca moved with a speed that was blinding. He didn't shout, didn't curse. His hand shot out, capturing Conti's wrist. There was a sickening crack, like a dry twig snapping, as he broke the man's index finger. Conti screamed, a high, pathetic sound, but Luca did not stop. He methodically moved to the next finger, and the next, his face a mass of detached, brutal efficiency. The sound was horrific, a series of pops and crunches that silenced the room more effectively than any shout. He was fulfilling his promise, the one he had made in a dirty alley to a terrified florist. But this was a public execution of a principle. This was a lawless jungle, enacted before its most powerful citizens. No one touches what is mine. When it was over, and Conti lay sobbing on the floor, cradling his ruined hand, Luca turned back to Isabella. He pulled a handkerchief white, impossibly white, just like the first one from his pocket, and meticulously wiped the blood from his fingers. His breathing was even. His gaze found hers again, and in its dark depths, she saw not a monster, but a king defending his queen. Later, in the silent car ride home, he spoke, his voice rough in the darkness. "They will not look at you that way again. They will see you, and they will see me. They will see my strength in your spine. They will see my will in your eyes. You are not a prize, Isabella. You are a statement." Back in her apartment, the adrenaline finally began to ebb, leaving a strange, hollow calm in its wake. She walked to the mirror and looked at the woman in the crimson dress. Her face was pale, but her eyes were different. They held a hard, glittering light, a reflection of the violence she had witnessed and, in some deep, unacknowledged way, sanctioned. The last vestiges of the woman who trembled in a flower shop had been scoured away. She had been pulled into the heart of the darkness, and instead of being consumed, she had learned to see in the black. The flower had not been crushed. It had grown thorns, sharp and resilient. The garden was a dangerous, bloody place, but she was no longer just a bloom within it. She was its mistress. She belonged to the wolf, and the terrifying, intoxicating truth was that she no longer wanted to escape. The hunt was over. A new one was just beginning. This concludes Isabella's descent into a world of power and dark devotion. Her story is one of transformation, of finding strength in the most dangerous of places. If you were captivated by the twisted bond between Isabella and Luca, if you crave more tales where love and obsession blur into something darker, then subscribe. A world of shadowy romance and thrilling power struggles awaits. Don't miss the next story.